Welcome to Career Pathways, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, part of Leadership Month 2021, presented by the USC Rossier School of Education. Please welcome the moderator for today's session, Dr. Darline Robles, Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion and Professor of Clinical Education at the USC Rossier School of Education.
Thank you, Matt, for that nice introduction, and welcome everyone in the audience. Great to have you here with us. I am so pleased to have an amazing group of panelists with us who have chosen to be in this career pathway of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in their current roles. So it's my pleasure to introduce Narges Rabii-Rakin, who's a Chief Advisor for Academic and Diversity Programs at Rancho, Santiago Community College District. And also with us is Tammy Stevens, who's the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And Diontrey Thompson, the Senior Director of Strategy, Culture, and Belonging at Genentech, and all are Rossier alum. So welcome, panelists. So good to have you today. So I'm so excited to learn from you as well, and I know our audience will. So I'm going to ask the first question and see who would like to start. Tell us why you chose to pursue a career as Chief Diversity Officers in your organizations or in other organizations and positions you've held. Who would like to start? Oh, Tammy, I'm going to ask Tammy.
Yeah, I was going to go ahead and jump in. I was trying to be like the cordial panelist. For me, I got into DEI because I worked in finance and consulting and in several different industries. And I felt like I was always changing myself to fit into the culture of whatever organization I was in. There were times when I would go home crying because I literally felt like I had to leave so much of myself at home and really couldn't show up authentically at work. It started to show up physically, like I would eat my emotions. And so like physically gaining weight, my personality started changing. And so I just kind of had this epiphany. I was working in banking and I went through a leadership kind of training course, and we had to do like this visioning. Like they had us close our eyes and think about what we wanted to be doing with our lives and careers in 20 years. And I woke up out of that, or came up out of that thinking to myself, this is not what I want to do. Right? Like this is not what I want to do. It doesn't feel good. So I made a very intentional decision to leave what I was doing. I was very highly compensated. So it was thinking about the financial implications of changing my career, thinking about how my family might be disappointed in me leaving engineering, going into something that they didn't know what I was doing. DEI is so ambiguous and people are like, what is that? And what exactly will you be doing? But I knew I had to make that choice for myself. And I really wanted to go somewhere and create a space where others didn't have to feel like they had to lose themselves to fit into any organizational culture. So that's why.
Thank you, Tammy. You speak to that personal passion that you wanted to find in your work. You know, money is absolutely wonderful, but you have to feel the passion and personal. So thank you. Who would like to go next?
I'm happy to jump in. And Tammy, I didn't even know that. And we cohort members. So for me, I didn't even know I wanted a career in DEI. Like, honestly, like I just kind of stumbled in it. Like probably like most of us probably did in some way or another. I didn't know it was a field of practice or let alone an industry. And so when I discovered DEI, it was really by happenstance. I was working in higher education administration and looking to be an administrator on a campus. And I realized there was these people working behind the scenes to create a culture, to create environments where students felt welcome, belonged, and can thrive in spaces. And I remember being an undergrad, like, oh, this is what the folks were doing for me. And so when I entered the workforce, I really didn't know like I could have a specialized job in diversity and inclusion. Like it was actually something I could do. And I remember having conversations with certain leaders and administrators across campus saying like, hey, like I'm engaged in this work. I want to do D&I work. I want to contribute to the ways in which we're making environments where students feel like, to Tammy's point, feel like they can be themselves, feel like they can show up and be whoever they wanted to be. And it kind of became research is me search to some degree. And I literally took that as an opportunity to kind of explore this world of DEI. And I remember my first job, it was at the Black Community Services Center at Stanford University. And I was nervous to take the leap, honestly. I was like, am I going to be pigeonholed as the D&I guy? Like, is there going to be opportunities? Let alone, I'm only focusing on the Black community. And so what does that mean? And I just remember just taking the risk and taking a leap into that space and realize like, oh, it's so much more. Even in just the Black community, there's not a monolithic in the way in which we identify, are created, and like how we experience the world around us. And so I took that as an experience to kind of build out my skill set. So I took a little more research. I engaged in studies in literature. I wanted to understand like how do people form identity formations and things. So I not only did like research, I engaged students and people. I just started having a whole bunch of conversations because again, there's not a roadmap to being a DEI professional. So we all enter it in different ways, but I found myself honing my skill sets. And what I realized is it was about creating space. It was making conversations accessible for people in this way. And so that kind of kicked me down a career pathway that I didn't even know I wanted. And so I'm happy where I am today because again, I get to do that in the work I'm doing now. But yeah, that's kind of just how I ended up. It was really by accident.
Great, thank you. Well, there is no such thing as accidents, they say, Diontrey. You are where you're supposed to be. Nargis.
Yes, thank you. And I want to first start off by thanking everyone and this impressive panel that I get to be a part of and these colleagues that I have met. So I have been teaching in the higher education in community college for 20 years. This is my 21st year. I know I look so young, but it really is been 20 years. And I have been doing DEI work, honestly, this entire time. It just wasn't called DEI work. It didn't have this title or this designation. And so I teach history and political science, and I have always taught it from the ground up. So where we talk about normal history class, you would hear about kings and monarchs and rulers and tyrants and such. I always taught it from the perspective of the working class, the peasant class. Certainly one of my specialties is the American slave trade. And so I have this sort of historical background already and was teaching it from that perspective. And honestly, I say this to my friends and colleagues all the time that I believe tenure was there to protect people like me because I needed to be able to speak truth to power and not lose my daily income. And it really has been a very eye-opening pathway for me, a journey that I've been on. And I'm very proud to be doing the DEI work that I've done now for Rancho Santiago Community College District. Santa Ana College is one of our colleges. We have a 2-college system. Santa Ana is one of the oldest colleges in California and a Hispanic serving institution. So it has a very diverse background, a very diverse student population, and we're only trying to build upon that further and opening the Office of Diversity in its inaugural office. I am the first to hold this position. So there's been a lot of work building from the ground up. And I want to tell everyone who's listening here, there is no magic pathway or a magic wand to this. It is a journey of learning. I myself have learned a lot. Even though I brought 20 years in, there's a lot of learning to do and reports, lots of report writing. So I think that we are in a very, very good space. I can tell you as a historian, I am absolutely thrilled to be doing this work in this time so that I could influence the history, so that I could influence the narrative and teach our children to be better than we were. So I'm very excited to be a part of this.
Thank you, Nargis. So you touch a little bit about what you currently do. So I'd like to ask you, all of you, to go a little bit more into about your current role and responsibility, a little bit about your organization, because you all represent different types of organization, higher ed, medical field, a startup tech, I think is yours, Diontrey, if I may be smuggling, something like that anyway. But again, tell us about your current roles and responsibilities and a little bit more background on your organization. I'll start with Diontrey.
Yeah, happy to jump in. And Dr. Robles, you are spot on slightly. We are the originators of biotech, actually,
See,
in South
I
San
knew-
Francisco. And so
Totally like that.
Genentech is a biotech company. And so my job there is I'm the senior director of strategy, culture, and belonging. And what that is just a fancy title to say is I lead our Dni business partnering team. And so supporting the 13 business functions across the enterprise, as well as learning and development for Dni. So helping people, again, make it accessible for them, unconscious bias, allyship, advancing racial equity work. And then the third part, how I would couch my job, is really helping us, because we are part of a global company called Roche, and I'm helping the D&I area of practice kick off. So how we think about D&I globally across the 100,000 employee population. And so it's really been kind of cool to kind of jump in, because my office specifically, we had never had a chief diversity officer. And so in the last year and a half, when I think about the work that we have done as a team, we have made major strides in fostering belonging, transforming society, because we have a responsibility to give to society and help change the narrative around pharmaceuticals, big pharma. What is that? What does it mean? And then also for our patients, advancing inclusive research, health equity. So getting more folks who look like us on this call in clinical trials, helping making sure it's accessible, going into communities where they might not have had access before, partnering with community centers. So I am really privileged to say, like, I get to work and do a lot of cool things. I have my hands in a lot of different pots. I get to do a little teaching and learning elements. I get to work with people on a day-to-day basis. I get to serve paid people who look like me and help make sure they have access. So that's just a little bit, but.
Great. Nargis, you started a little bit about the organization. Can you tell us a little bit more of your current roles? Because I think what Diontrey talked about is that the importance of being that person that leads that and broaden your reach. So if you could tell us a little bit more, Nargis.
Absolutely. So our organization also did not have an Office of Diversity. Diversity was embedded in human resources, and it was predominantly focused on hiring and recruitment. And so the Office of Diversity was created really in the wake of the George Floyd killings and sort of those racial reckoning that has been overdue and is now arrived. And so our Board of Trustees created the Office of Diversity, and the Chancellor appointed me to that inaugural role. My job before this role was, as I said, I was a history professor. I was also president of the Faculty Association. So I was deeply involved with the union and in ensuring diversity initiatives within the union for 2,000 faculty members. So now taking on this role, it really was sort of the expansion of the work I was already doing within the union. And what I initially, again, because there was no structure, similar to Diontrey's position, because there was no structure before, I started off right away with creating pathways for professors, those who have master's degrees or ABD or have a PhD who want to teach in community college. What is the pathway on teaching into community college? So we created these diversity pathways into how to become a professor, basically a tenured professor. And we created trainings for that. It's all free. So if we didn't charge anyone, again, trying to break down those barriers of access. So we have this program, the certificate program that we created. And then the second academy was to train our own, right? Workforce development and also professional development for our own. So we created a diversity initiatives, creating 24 modules of training for our own employees, and then a specific one for managers, because managers have extra duties that they have to be responsible for, especially in providing equity and infusing diversity into evaluations and creating those professional developments, creating those ladders for upward mobility for all people, but specifically for a diverse population. So that's part of my role. I also wrote the EEO plan for our district and did climate surveys and ran a benchmark so that we could find out where are the gaps within our organization, addressing those gaps. And that would be sort of the plan for next year. The district is 4,000 employees strong, 2 colleges and a satellite site. And they have nearly a $300 million budget. So it's a big organization, and it's very centrally located in Orange County. So it was overdue to have an Office of Diversity. And I think that within higher education throughout the state of California, we really need to have designated offices. and this is now my editorial, I believe that for a long time, these roles were in HR because it's kind of a human resources thing. But I think that they have to be designated, they have to be separate. There needs to be a direct pathway from the diversity officer or director, VP, what have you, to the CEO, so that there is direct communication about what is the climate of the environment, what is happening sort of at that level, and they get that message directly, and it doesn't sort of get bogged down in HR. That's my little editorial on why this role should be separate.
Well, again, more than editorial, but I think a really good, strong suggestion. Thank you, Nargis. So Tammy, tell us about your roles, because I think you talked a little bit about, your passion and finding that, and obviously you found something that speaks to your heart. So tell us more about your role and responsibilities and your organization.
Absolutely. So I too am in an inaugural role. I am one of two of the first Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusions at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, or HHMI. We are headquartered in Chevy Chase, Maryland. We are the best kept secret in the DMV area, which is pros and cons, and it was intentional at one point, but now thinking about this from an inclusive perspective, we have to do more in the community and raise our visibility. It was very intentional. We are about 2,400 employees. We have our own research campus. So if you are into bio research and you want to do basic science research, we are the cream of the crop, right? You want to come here because all you have to do is do your science research, which becomes the problem with DEI, right? Because literally we have people who want to just do their job and not think about how DEI needs to be embedded in everything that you do. So it's a very fun challenge to solve. We engage with academia a lot because we have a lot of investigators. So we pay the salary benefits for a lot of scientific researchers on campuses across the US. So we are very well known in that space. It is interesting because we have created our first 10-year DEI goal plan. So it will be publicly announced in October. And so it'll be very interesting to see how it is received. There are some external facing goals because we have DEI type programs long before we had the role that I'm in. But now we also have some internal goals that we need to work on as an organization to create the right climate and culture for diverse people and for everyone to come in and thrive and feel like they can be their best selves at work. So more to come on that. Stay tuned. And I definitely want to hear what people think when they see our, as we like to call them, our bold and audacious goals that we will drop in a few months.
We used to call that in my system BHOG goals, BHOG. BHOG. So all of you have shared a little bit about your career paths, even prior to DEI. What I want to know is in your previous positions prior to the current positions you have, what were some transferable skills that helped you really, all of you are succeeding in this role, that you could say, this I really brought with me, and maybe some things I had to let go because I may have been a certain style of a leader, but now I need to do this. If you could just share a little bit about those transferable skills and knowledge that you brought to your current position. And I'll start with you, Nargis.
So I think that it was really important to have a passion for diversity and equity inclusion, but also to have done your research, right? Because we're educators, you need to have read the literature, and it's recent and it's very easy to find. Just Google it and you'll get the list. The list I worked off of is actually the DEI reading list from Harvard University. It's posted public. You could get the list, and I started really trying to educate myself further as I was educating my students. The more research I did, the more animated and elaborate my lectures became. And once I was appointed to this role, I set out to build collaboration with other groups of people, and it helped to have that link already within the organization. So you build those affinity groups and you bring the people who work with you, right, onto your bus, because you're driving this DEI bus as Dr. Garcia used to say, and you want to make sure you bring all the people on the bus with you that are supportive of your role. Because what I believe truly is that there are many of us who are sort of the designated leaders for DEI, but also there are many who want to support, but really don't know what to do or how to do it and how to approach. And so creating those spaces was very important. So having that collaborative mindset, having that notion that everyone and all voices should be included. So that's really important. The other skill set was, well, and it helps to be a good writer and orator, because you've got to get out on the road and take the show on the road, because you got to go around and talk to people and engage with them, find out what are their successes and their challenges, and then address those challenges and closing those gaps. And when you show up in a meeting, in a Zoom meeting with 30 people who only have complaints, and you're there to try to hear what is it that you can do to help them, it immediately calms the room. But most importantly, you get all the advocates who then now come on board with you to try to help you drive this DEI train. We put out a report, a 79-page report about a diversity report and our climate survey. It was written and edited and by these groups, by the group themselves. There was a lot of input, and that was very helpful because it set the benchmark about where it is our institution is going. The other aspect of it is, I think it's very important to get training. If you have no training in this, or if you don't have a background in it, there are universities and different organizations that provide training. And I think it's very important to get that training, because it starts your sort of juices flowing into and really directing it in a more academic way, in that, so that you can speak to this more eloquently and make yourself the expert, right? This is how we learn. We all need to be lifelong learners. And if your space is not DEI, that you absolutely can get the training to become that expert.
Thank you. Tammy, I know a little bit about your history because I know a little bit about you. And so I know you have a very unique background, starting with MIT and engineering. So how were those skills into what some would say soft skills versus hard skills, right? So tell about those, what's transferable for your different leadership positions that you've held.
So you're right. I probably have had the most non-traditional kind of career path and transferable skills. So as I mentioned, I left banking and transitioned into academia with no prior experience in academia. I left banking and went and became the associate dean at MIT in the Office of Minority Education. How did that happen? Here's skill number one, networking, right? That is a skill that is transferable regardless of industry or what you do. I was talking to a friend, we had served on a board together, and said, look, I'm sure I want to try to get into DEI. I love learning. He was like, oh, I have an open position coming up. Okay, I said, what do I need to do? He was like, don't worry about it. Came through, did the interviews, and then I was hired there. I would also say one of the things that I had to skill up on, right? Because I came out of banking, had a background in engineering. As you said, it's very black and white in that space, right? Was empathy. I had to learn how to turn up my empathy because I was so used to dealing with just numbers and not thinking about people as people. And working with students, you have to have a high level of empathy for them, their backgrounds, their families, working with other administrators. So that in my first year or so in my role as a dean was the hardest thing for me to do, because I'm failing, right? I knew in my mind I wasn't doing the best that I could do, but that meant I had to get comfortable with myself and sharing who I was. And that was not something I had to do in any other roles. So you have to be able to make yourself vulnerable, because that allows other people to start to trust you more when you are vulnerable with them. So that is one skill I would definitely say, is learning how to be empathetic. I left my role, as you know, working at MIT, right, in the first semester of the program, and moved from Cambridge back to the DC area, where I went into diversity recruiting. And I was in a new role there too, where I was leading our new hire and intern diversity recruiting programs for an organization that went from 65,000 to 100,000 people very quickly, and I had responsibilities across the entire organization. And again, a lot of that was around networking and problem solving, right? I am an engineer by background, and all I did was really take problem solving from science to human problems, right? So for me, it was literally thinking like, what path can I take? And sometimes I had to take the path with the most resistance. Sometimes I wanted the path with the least resistance, but sometimes that wasn't always available. But always thinking about, how do I solve problems? And sometimes you have to have different solutions depending on what you're trying to solve. So for me, that's kind of how I look at this work. Is everybody's going to change or come into this from a different place. And so you need to meet them where they are. And so how do you do that? So just being open to approaching this and solving this from multiple facets.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammy. Diontrey, what skills? I know you have a lot of skills. I know that as well. I know a lot about all three of you. So I know you've got them, but what are some that you had early on that you're taking with you now?
Yeah, maybe I'll blend a little bit what my other two panelists have shared. For me, it's always been about curiosity. Like, we're people, we're messy. And I think that's part of my struggle and part of the humbleness of it. Like, I've never felt like an expert in this space. I don't try to pretend to be, because I can't know everything about everyone. But what I can be is curious, and to Tammy's point, like empathetic. Like, I want to learn. I want to understand your background. I want to understand your history. I want to understand the context and how you grew up. That might inform how you show up today in this world. And I think that has been a skill set that has served me well. It's just being curious, asking questions. You can use questions to diffuse almost any situation that you're in, and it's not as off-putting. And so again, instead of trying to be the person who, I've never been the person who needed to be at the front of the room, but I've always been in the back influencing. And so when I think about this work, it's a lot of influence. We spend a lot of time trying to share compelling stories, arguments, data, to help people understand like why this work is important. How do you lean into this space? And that's all important in it. But again, if you can't touch into the individual who's in front of you or the leadership that's in front of you and help them understand, like, how do you come into this work and help it make sense? That I think has been super pivotal to making large transformation in organizations and helping them get bought in, helping them to commit to it, helping them figure out like, what is the action you're going to take in that? And I think a lot of that stemmed from my time in the academia. As Tammy mentioned, them students will run you ragged. As Dr. Robles knows, we probably ran you a little ragged too when we were your students. But like, literally, we wanted to be understood. And so instead of me trying to always make sure I'm understood first, I seek to understand before being understood in these spaces. And that has also served me well to help bringing, to Tammy's point, have advocates, have champions, have people who are leveraging their own positionality to help make influence and change in these spaces, or to help create change to some regard, to help make them feel empowered to kind of lean in the space. The other thing I might highlight is just, I love the notion of lifelong learning, but for me, there's another part of that is like critical thinking. Like, critical thinking is so key because the topics that we're dealing with in this space are so nuanced and so personal that you have to play all ends, from like what's the worst case scenario to what's the best case scenario, and realize that you're going to fall somewhere all over that spectrum because every person is going to receive it differently. And so I really think those are kind of my high points. So like, if you have curiosity, it'll serve you well. Think of this as a position of influence. Like, most of the times in DEI, like, we're not the people actually making decisions. We low-key are influencing you to align and move in the right direction. And then also taking critical thinking as like, hey, there's not a right or wrong way to do this, but I need to think about all the ways that it might impact someone in this space. And you have to ask yourself, who's in the room and who's not in the room? And so you have to take those perspectives into those spaces with you. And if you solve for the most marginalized group of people, you ultimately have the curb cut effect, where a bunch of other people also benefit from the conversations that we're having.
I'm going to stick with your answer because it also brings up another question that I'd like you to add to that I'll ask the other panelists. As the audience, there may be in the audience who really want to aspire to be in this role. And we all know here that's a challenging role. It's not something that you're passionate about, but it's not an easy role to fulfill in any organization. And so how would you, as you talk about, the influence and being in the back, what advice would you give to those who want to aspire to this, to manage their expectations so that they are set up for success. And because oftentimes we have this goal and we want to achieve it, but we didn't go, oh, it's all about me and I didn't. What advice, adding to what you just said, Diontrey, would you say to them about managing expectations and making sure that you acknowledge and set yourself up for success, even during the trying times?
Yeah. And maybe the first part I would do is acknowledge that the work is hard. Like the work is hard, it's challenging, and it's rewarding all at the same time. And I think if you can accept the fact that it's not going to be an easy task and that you're not always going to get it right, you're going to make mistakes, because I think sometimes people struggle with that. And which is why I think one of the panelists shared, like, they don't know how to get involved. They don't know how to engage because they're fearful that they may make a mistake. You as that professional, you probably feel that 10 times more because the people are looking to you for answers. And so when I think about this work and how you navigate it to kind of manage those expectations, go in and give yourself some grace. Honestly, I know we throw these words around, but I really do mean give yourself some grace in these spaces, because that will help sustain you, because you're not perfect. We're all flawed. We just talked about how being human is messy. And so again, when you're working with people, you're going to encounter some really good wins where you're like, man, that facilitation I just did around unconscious bias, it was amazing. And you're feeling all pumped and nobody may say anything about it. It's not you have to manage that. It's not instant. Sometimes people have to sit with the things that they're learning and coping with, because it's the first time conversations for them that they're like, you want them to see the transformation immediately. The reality of transformation is going to happen a month, a year, 5 years down the road, and you may not get to witness it. You might just hear about the transformation that happens. So again, like if you can give yourself some grace, accept that you're not going to get immediate gratification. Like there's some things that we consider like small wins, but nobody's really looking for the small wins. But you should celebrate those. You should celebrate them and know that the bigger wins are going to come as you, I think, I forget who said it earlier, but just like you build this army of folks who are engaged, they're catalysts. Like you are essentially a catalyst to this work. It's not all about you. Take yourself out of it and make it about the people around you, because that's how we all win and move forward in this space.
Thank you. Nargis, would you like to add about that? How do you manage the expectations?
Yes.
Because in your role, you have, you've got this plan and we're going to do it, but sometimes it may not be the way you want to play out.
That's right. And I think it's really important that we highlight the successes, right? And we advertise and brand those successes. And then what didn't work, I call a pilot. So we pilot those that didn't work. Okay, let's bring it back and try it again and fix it. Pilot's my favorite word. But I think that managing expectations, so there are expectations about salary, there are expectations about working conditions, there's expectations about staff. I know that I have talked to colleagues who do this work and within the associations, and they'll say, I came in and there was no staff and there was no help, or I had many people helping me, too many almost, and it was going in all different kinds of directions. I think that when it comes to managing your expectations, you have to start small. And again, I go back to pilot. I started my DEI work very small in classrooms. That's where it started. And then it manifested into the department, then to the division, then over to the association. I mean, I built upon the experiences of the past. And so nobody falls into this and becomes the chief just out of the blue. You've obviously done other work to lead to this place. And so if you are starting off, don't expect that, corner office with the staff and the budget. It doesn't start like that. You have to start small and build up, because as Diontrey said, you have to build a sort of a credible space where you are the expert. Who are you to be in here talking about DEI? Show us what you've done. Where is your sort of score sheet on the work that you've done? And so that's what you're doing. You're building that credibility and that notion of that you're accountable to your peers and to the institution as the expert. So that's sort of, I would say, to managing your expectations is come to the table prepared, but do the work. You've got to do the work. So
thank you. Tammy, your advice.
So here's how I think about this work. There's before George Floyd's murder and there's since George Floyd's murder. Before I hired people on my team, I had very, very intentional conversations about, if this is the work that you want to do, understand that your name may have an asterisk by it, right? Because people, you're going to have some of the most difficult conversations with people and uncomfortable conversations, and people don't like that. So understand that if this is the career path you want, you may not get to move into other spaces because people are always going to associate you with this work and how you made them feel uncomfortable with this work. So I had people like, oh, I'm not sure that's what I want to do. So I want them to understand that. What I will say is, since George Floyd, everybody's now a DEI expert, right? You're like, well, where were you before, right? Like, where was all this energy and engagement around this? And I think now it's become so ambiguous what DEI actually means, that I'm like, that was a DEI learning? Like, that's not what I would call that as a practitioner, but we're going to go with that. So I think just being mindful that at some point, hopefully this has become a movement, but if it hasn't become a movement, there was a time before this where literally people did not want to truly engage in this work. And it was much more difficult to call yourself someone who wanted to be a DEI practitioner. So we're in a good phase right now.
Good advice. So as you said, Tammy, since George Floyd's murder, announcements from everywhere, right? From CVS, even from Walgreens, just announcements looking for. I think in higher ed, I'm sure, Nargis, you get lots of applicants. Here's this, all of you do, and in tech, big tech, medical, other organizations. What advice would you give them to evaluate a potential employer's to determine if it's the right one for you, right? Because you just don't want to go get a job because it's got that title. I mean, you can, people do, but what are things that you look for that said, this is going to be good for me? And I'm going to say, who would like to start?
Okay. I'll start this one, because for me, as I started in my role in October of 2020, and that was post George Floyd's murder. So I can tell you, I had a lot of organizations across multiple industries, like every day, multiple. And I'm like, whoa, this is a lot. When I was looking for opportunities before this, it was like, oh, okay, few and in between. But I ultimately landed where I did because, one, my question was this a reactive position to what is going on in our society currently? I did not want to be part of a role that was reactive, because that meant when we get past this possible movement or moment, this role may not have the influence, or it may even be eliminated, right? I also wanted a role, someone on the panel mentioned earlier about positionality and not sitting in HR. I did not want to have this role sit in HR. This role reports directly and sits in the president's office, right? Because structurally, you're trying to influence the entire organization, and that starts at the top, right? You can do your grassroots efforts and have the employees and everyone else doing stuff, but if the top is not interested in the work, it's nice to have grassroots, but it's really not going to have the same level of impact. So those were really the two things that I was looking for as I thought through, where do I want to go with my career and what type of organization I wanted to be part of.
Great. Who would like to, how do you know it's the right one for you? You obviously, Nargis, were from the system, but obviously you made some decision that it was something you could do, because you could obviously say, never mind, I'll be over here and do my job. So what was the deciding factor for you to take this on?
For me, honestly, I really do want to commend Tammy for the before and after George Floyd, because that is definitely a time marker that we need to acknowledge. For me, doing this work, as I said, I had been doing it for so long already, just didn't have the title or the compensation for it. But for me, what was so important was that affecting the organization, the entire structure as a whole was very important, because here I was teaching, classes, 6-7 classes a semester, average 45 students. I mean, do the math, over 20 years, that's a lot of students that have gone through my classes that sort of got that education. But here it's much more sort of holistic in one organization from top top down and also from the bottom up, right? Because the work has been occurring. It just didn't have this designation. But for me, it was important that the leader, just like Tammy said, that our CEO, our chancellor of our district, actually did believe in this work, was himself someone who had a narrative, an immigrant narrative, a diversity background himself, and wanted to institute that within the organization. And I found in him a partner in doing this work. Now, that's not to say that we haven't had our hiccups, that we haven't had our obstacles, because I don't know how it is in Genentech or where you are, Tammy, on the East Coast, but there are a lot of people who don't want this, and they don't want it from the organization, or they don't want it from somebody that looks like me, or with my background. And so there are those struggles, and the challenges, but I believe that speaking for myself, I am absolutely passionate about this. I will not go away, and no is just a negotiating point. So let's start there and keep the conversation going, because I don't think it's going to go away. I've heard through different sort of rumblings that, oh, this DI thing is going to end. It's just a fad. It's not a fad. It's not going away, because we are now awake to this, and we're speaking to this, and we've created spaces where we can do that. And I think that is really, really important to remember, that if you don't have an advocate, if you are, apply for a job and they're just really going to put you in the corner and essentially check the box, you don't want to be a part of that organization, because there is burnout in this job. There are a lot of struggles. You take it home with you, and because when you're emotional about it and so passionate about it, it is the fabric of who you are. So if you don't get the vibe in the interview that they really believe in this, and that they also have done work in DEI work already, right? Then you may not want that organization. You may wait and come back later when they've, grown up and woken up to this is where we live.
Thank you, Nargis. Kind of like having seen the light. Diontrey, what your advice?
Yeah, and have a transparent moment here. Like, I've only been in biotech for the last year and a half. It's my first time in tech. I came from the academy. I was at Stanford for 10 years. And when I made the decision to leave, it was a hard decision to leave a place that was familiar, to step into a world where I didn't know, because I'll be honest, DEI in the academy and university system looks a little different in biotech. It looks a little different in tech, I'm learning. And so again, for me, my evaluation process was, what kind of environment do I want to be in? And so to what both of the panelists kind of share, like, for me, it was the commitment. And so just as much, you have to remember, just as much as they're interviewing you, you are interviewing them. And part of this work is asking tough questions. So I asked questions around, like, what's the culture like for being a Black man? What's your numbers? Some of the things that I just wasn't able to find on the website. And I put them to the test to say, like, what does this mean for me to be in this space? And how can I be successful here? Knowing what you know about the numbers, knowing about some of the experiences of some of these people. And so during my interview process, I had a really transparent conversation. And I think that's also what sold him on me. Like, he was willing to ask hard questions, and they were willing to answer. And their answers were not perfect. I'll be honest. I met with a lot of companies in tech when I made the decision to leave higher ed. And for me, Genentech was one of the places that it felt very authentic, because their mission was around patients. Their mission was around people. And that for me resonated, especially coming from where I worked with students most of my career. And I was transforming lives. And now I get to work on behalf of patients and transform and make sure they have access to medical drugs and things that will save lives. That for me was super important, to be in a space where I can have that kind of mission-centered vision. I think, to Tammy's point, the fact that we report directly to the CEO, people think about D&I as just being about people, but it's also a business imperative. And so the fact that reporting to the CEO allows me to, and I shared this earlier, like, I work with 13 business functions to say, like, how do we embed it for each respective business? So how is it part of our research and early development? So, like, if I'm working with a scientist, helping them think about, like, we're talking about all these people, like, we need more folks of color. And you're saying, like, why? Like, we're scientists. Yes, that's part of your identity, but let's explore your identity as a scientist. What made you want to be a scientist? What family thing? So imagine we have some people from all different types of backgrounds, and what things we might study. And so bringing those types of conversations to life for folks was super important. Like being able to do that kind of work in this space, and were they open to learning and changing? Our CEO said, and he's a relatively new to his role, but he said, I want my legacy to be D&I. I think when you have that type of messaging and support, and I mentioned earlier that our office is only a year and a half old at this point, but it's probably one of the most well-resourced D&I offices I've ever seen in tech. Like we have 20 plus people as full-time staff members. Most D&I offices can barely get 2. And so seeing a company that will put their money where their mouth is, because my boss says it, you budget what you value. And so if you value this work, you're going to pay us and compensate us for this work. You're going to compensate us for our labor. And so don't be afraid to ask those questions, to lean into that space, but also ask what's your motivation for coming into this space? Because some people do like the green side of things where a company's new, they're starting off because they get to build it. And so if you're a builder, build. Some people like to have more established places that are kind of in it, they're ingrained because they know that's not labor I have to take on. There's a starting point and benchmark for us to work from here. And so as you're considering these offers, think about what your motivation is and where do you want to contribute and how do you want to contribute? Because I think that totally matters. And so for me coming into a new space where it's a whole new office, we're a year and a half old, I was like, I want to build. I want to build and see what we can do. And what we did in a year, I was blown away by what we did in a year. And so, yeah.
So adding to that, I noticed that, I mean, I knew this, but I re-noticed all of you report to the CEO, right? So that's like, okay, so they have your ear and that's a good thing because you want to make sure that they have your ear and you have theirs and that. So the question from one of the audience is, even though you do, we know that as Diontrey said, people are messy, human beings are messy, we do a lot of things. And so what have you done to incentivize? I think you talked a little bit about earlier, Nargis, when you have supervisors or leadership teams, because your CEO may be committed as the one you mentioned, Diontrey, this is my legacy, but maybe other cabinet members aren't, maybe other VPs aren't. How do you have them also be willing to be lifelong learners? Because they may think they have DEI, they may think they know it, but they're not equipped to do the work. That was one of the things. So they want to do it, but they're not equipped. What, who would like to answer that? Or maybe one or two of you would say, what do you do in that case? Because it does take, movement, but they're in leadership roles and they think, well, I could do this. And maybe they're not ready. Go ahead, Tammy.
I'll tell you what we're doing. So this year of 2021 is foundational learning for everyone. So we have done like low effort speakers. So we have 6 foundational topics, anti-racism. We're doing equity and inclusion from both a race and gender perspective, defining whiteness. So we're doing like these really foundational topics in DEI that everybody can participate in. But what we're also doing is individual cohorts for the leadership team. Where each of these topics, we have an external facilitator, and that was intentional so that myself or my colleague, who's the other director, wasn't there and get like this kind of interesting perspective on our leadership team. They could open up and be very candid about where they are in their journey with DEI and what challenges they have. And so now they also have coaching. Right, so they're going through this cohort together, but they also have coaching because everybody comes into this space from such a different perspective, and that's helping some. I can tell you some are very challenged by that because you're bringing some might think stuff that should be left at the door into work, but you have to bring your whole self into this work in order to actually make the change. And again, I think we keep talking about it, the top has to change. So it was important that our leaders all get on board and understand what the vision is from our CEO, because like Diontrey, this is her legacy. And you need to be on board with it, but you also need to have your heart in it. And so I think that's what we're still trying to work on with some of them, is really getting that heart into this work.
Thank you.
I could just build off a little bit of what Tammy said as well. I think for us, this is my day-to-day job. Like my team, we meet with leaders all day, every day. And we tackle it from a multi-pronged approach, as Tammy kind of alluded to. For us, it looks like ongoing conversations because people do think they know D&I. And so remember what I said earlier, ask them some questions. Can they explain it? Do you really know it if you can't explain it? Can you talk about it? Because other people want to hear you talk about it. And so we engage them in those types of conversations. I think it helps that we have the CEO's ear. And so again, we're able to influence overarching the organization because he does want it to be his legacy. So we implemented what we call D&I officer action plans. So every officer had to have a commitment to D&I, and they had to have between 2 to 6. But what we did with that, because people didn't understand, like, how do I put this in action? We made it accessible. We highlighted pre-populated options for them to see how D&I already exists probably in their everyday work, but they just didn't think of it as such. And so they made commitments, and then we made sure to hold them accountable. Transparency. We said, okay, you selected these. Now we're going to show the entire business what you selected so they can hold you accountable as well as not just accountability, but be part of the journey that we're all on collectively together. And in our first year of doing it, we had a 99% completion rate. We had over 728 actions selected by leaders. So again, as I told them, if we even make good on half of this, just think about the impact we have already made in our organization. The other thing, I think, to Tammy's point, is the education. You have to shift it from being people looking at education as just like this one and done. People like, I went through unconscious bias, I'm done. And so we reframed it. We said it's a journey. D&I is a journey. You're on a journey. You're constantly learning. You're not beholden to be who you were yesterday or a year before. And so why do you think if you went through one class, that's enough? And so we are doing similar things, but we made sure it was targeted around the work that we thought was going to move it forward. So allyship's a part of that. Advancing racial equity, because there was times before George Floyd, like we've been battling this much longer than George Floyd. And so again, you have to understand some of that history because we all were taught different histories in school. And some people don't know the same history. And so we're doing some of that education today to make sure people know, like, these are why these conversations are so important, to allow people to bring themselves and show up in the ways that feel most authentic. And I want to be clear, I don't want the worst parts of you showing up at work. So we say, bring your full self, leave those worst parts, like leave the problematic stuff back. There's some problematic stuff I work with you on, but again, that's because you're having to unlearn some things and relearn some new things. And so those are just a couple of ways that we are really engaging leaders in that conversation. And when you don't have folks like your CEO, find good sponsors. There are people who are committed to this work who may not know what to do, but they are willing to leverage their positionality, their voice to influence other leaders to help make a change in these spaces.
So there's 2 more questions that I want to make sure from the audience that we add. So the next question is because I think the third question I've been asked, I think is something that all of us would like to hear, myself included. The next one is how this audience member said it's difficult, she has seen, for people of color to enter the higher ed space. So what have you found that has made it possible for all of you to enter at different points to get your foot in the door so that you move up into higher ed space, either being a DEI officer or just being, again, in a leadership role in higher ed? Would like to share.
You know, my favorite word is networking. Go for it.
I'm sorry, Tammy, go ahead.
No, I was going to say networking. I mean, you now know at least all the panelists on here. I live on LinkedIn, and that might have been also because I was a recruiter, but I'm very active and engaged, and I will do what I can to always help anyone who reaches out with sincerely and wants to do this work. We all have to do this. It is hard to get into this space, into higher education, especially in certain parts of the country, right? I'm East Coast based. And so over here it's also very challenging, especially if you want to do like highly selective universities. It becomes even more challenging. So it becomes about who you know and knowing how to submit your application and what to include in your application. And so whoever wrote that, feel free to send me a LinkedIn request. I will accept it, and maybe we can have like a conversation about what you want to do with your career. career.
Thank you for that offer. Nargis.
So I'm in higher ed. I can tell you that it is difficult to break in. It's definitely not easy, and Diontrey could talk about it because he was from higher ed. So, and at a prestigious university at Stanford. So it is difficult to break in, but not impossible. And the key to this again is to build up your professional resume, to have that diversity lens, infusing DEI work into the work that you do, reimagining the work that you did, and how was it in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And where there are gaps in your education or in your training, you fill those in with professional development. I mean, I'm an educator, so I absolutely believe in training for everybody, including myself. I mean, everyone needs training. And then sort of what has already been said already is that notion of grace. Give yourself the grace and the time to become the DEI expert. It takes time. None of us were born this way. We all had lots of training, and we have a narrative that brought us into this space, right? Experiences in our own lives, as myself as an immigrant, those experiences and that lens brought me to this work. And so, you know, it's funny because I remember when I majored in history, my mother was like, "What do you mean? What are you going to do with that? How's that going to, you know, help your career in the future?" But being an immigrant, it was very important for me to understand where it is we came from as a nation, where we were headed, and then of course I expanded into other spaces. But this is the United States of amnesia. People don't remember. Okay. And they don't want to remember. And if it is negative or makes them feel uncomfortable, they want to push it aside and not address it. And what we need to do with diplomacy and tact and grace is to bring those people back into the conversation and make sure that all the voices are heard. And that takes training. If you don't know how to do that, you need to get yourself to that space and develop that empathetic skill set that Tammy was talking about. You have to have that in order to do this work, because there's burnout and it's difficult and people don't want to have these conversations because it's emotional. So that would be my advice. Also, LinkedIn is very important, and please send me a LinkedIn link and I will absolutely help. And I work at Rancho, Santiago Community College District. You can Google my name and get my email, send me an email, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you for that offer. Go ahead.
One thing, I agree with both panelists. The other thing you can do, there's a ton of Dni jobs out there, so it's not impossible. It's definitely, you can break in. But if you're at a company, let's say you don't want to leave your company, create it. Create the job you want to see and pitch it. I've done that a couple different times, both in higher ed and here, because I saw a gap. And you make the business case, you make a compelling argument, and you highlight. For me, it's about the receipts. So to the points that both panelists made, like, what can you do to highlight how have you done this work, and bring those receipts to bear, and use language like facilitating, understanding analysis, like start thinking about how you can apply that D&I lens to all your work. And you probably have already been doing it. You just need to shape a little, give a little reshift, a little rewording, and bam, you can actually turn it to actionable things. So many people are looking for D&I folks to come in and just change their organizations, but they need to see that your action, like what did you do to make that happen? Because they're looking for the credibility, because they're looking for I hate to say, like a quick fix, when the reality is not a quick fix. But that's going to get you initially the look at on the resumes.
So I'm going to ask you to be brief in your response, because I've got two more questions that I want to ask you before we ask the final question before we leave, because we're almost at the end of the time. So one of the audience says, so what suggestions? I'm not housed in DEI. I may be a staff person over here, and I'm working my little, office job. And I'm not in a leadership role. I'm not faculty, you know how they are hierarchical. How then do you suggest that I can contribute to DEI in my little cubicle, wherever I'm working? I don't even know if this is the case for this person, but that I also want to get experience. What do I do in an organization that may have it not be where your organization is? And in addition, what happens if I do it and someone says, "Oh, Darlene, that's not your work. Don't focus on that." And we've all heard that. I think we've all heard that. So if you could just kind of give me some ideas for this audience member and for the audience in this regard.
Volunteer. There's likely some kind of work happening around the D&I space at your company. You may be aware of, you may not. Just ask around, but volunteer. That's one of the simplest ways. Or if your company has like employee resource groups, we call them DNA groups, where like these affiliate organizations, those are groups, and they're definitely part of the work. And so if somebody says this is not part of the work, talk to them about why this is and ask them like, why do you not see a part of the work? Put it back on them.
Right, right. I absolutely love Diontrey's the suggestion that you create the office, you make the office, and maybe it doesn't have to be an office with staff or budget. You could start with an affinity group or a group of folks that come together and they build based on that, you know, that either an ethnicity or a race group or an interest in DEI work, and you start with those conversations and you take them back to your manager and the manager above them. The other thing I would suggest is that look at all the job descriptions in DEI right now. Just Google DEI careers and you'll get a whole bunch of hits from Google, and look at sort of the job descriptions and see how your experience and training fits into that, and see where those gaps are in your own training based on the jobs that are out there, and then go and seek the information to fill those gaps. And I know that Rossier has, they're working on a certificate, and so there are programs that can help you with the training.
Thank you. Tammy, do you want to add?
No, I think they hit it dead on with volunteer and employee resource groups.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. So the last question is, how do you nourish yourself? And this is personal, right? How do you nourish yourself so that you don't burn out? I find that equity work, as this person wrote, very emotionally demanding. And it is, because all of you have stayed right at the beginning. It's a passion you have. You want to be in your workplace authentically, being empathetic. That's an emotional, that's giving of yourself every day. So how do you nourish yourself so you get up the next day with the energy you need to take on the work? You may want to think about that and before you respond, or go ahead.
Understand the job won't hug you at night. That's probably the easiest way to tell you. Understand the job will not hug you at night. And so it is demanding. It is all the things that you mentioned. And so make sure you take time and make space for yourself. See your family, hang out with your if you have pets, kids, whatever, do something for you that's going to nourish your spirit. And realize, because many of us do this work because we're passionate about it, we're engaged in this work, we love it, we want to help people, that also takes a toll on your body. So make sure you check in with yourself. Ask yourself how you are doing and making sure you're fulfilling yourself and allowing other people to spill into you, because sometimes you can feel like you have the weight on the world on your shoulders. And so that would be my advice.
I agree. So I invested in a Peloton. So I am part of the Peloton community, or cult, as some people would say. Diontrey missed something that he did all the time when we were in the cohort, which is travel. And I mean, I know we're in a pandemic, but I think find whatever your passion, hobbies are, and do that. And I have a really good circle of people around me. So when I start to feel myself like being depleted, I just go to them, right? And they know when I want advice or when I'm just really need a sounding board just to say what I'm going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just let me vent. I don't want an answer. Just let me vent.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think purpose is really important. Whenever I burn out, just like everybody else, I refocus on, why am I doing this? Why am I in this space? I have a tenured job. I could be just teaching history and coasting. Why am I choosing to stand in the fire here? Why am I choosing that? And the answer to that is the purpose of this work feeds my soul. And as I said earlier, I have 2 small children. I am building a better world for them. And so I use them as my focal point and the purpose of doing this work. I'm not delusional in thinking that I'm going to be the change. Gandhi's quote, be the change. I don't think that I'm one, but I think I am one of many. And there is a group of us, a warrior class, that has to do the fighting now so that we build a better system for our kids. And so that really is, you have to go back to your purpose and what you're doing. And there was a question earlier in the chat about, what if you don't have a supportive boss or you don't have people who want you to do this? Find the advocates in a smaller group and build the support that way. It will start very small, a grain of salt, right? It'll start very, very small. But once you get a group of you together, you will be hard to ignore. So that's how you start small. You may not go straight to the CEO and they want that, but you can certainly build those affinity groups in a smaller circles and build up the momentum.
Right now, this is a question that I think we could not answer completely. So I'm just going to ask each of you to give me one or two responses. And I think because you said it, Nargis, this is what you did. And I think all of you have done this, create a climate survey. So what would be one or two questions you think should be in a climate survey to assess where your organization is in the DEI effort and work and where they want to go? Just one question or two.
I'm big on psychological safety questions, right? Because if I don't feel like I'm in a safe space, I'm never going to give you even a transparent answer to whatever you put on the climate survey.
Good
So
point.
that would be like a question I would get at, and I don't have the right wording in my head right now on the specific question, but that is kind of the question I would almost lead the survey with is, do you feel empowered? Do you feel like you can speak up? Do you feel you can share your voice authentically wherever you are in the organization?
Yeah, just building off of that, just keep it simple. We don't need big words, culture, inclusion, ask what you really want to know. Do I feel like I can show up as myself every day at work? That will tell you a little bit about authenticity. Ask them how receptive is, I find leadership receptive to new ideas and perspectives. Will tell you the openness of things. And so having straightforward questions that allow people to like, and then again, it's a snapshot in time. So it's in that moment. They're going to take whatever they heard that day, probably.
So I like the questions that have to do with disparity. So what is your perception of the disparities in your workspace? Do you feel supported in your workspace? And do you feel that your diversity, the diversity within you is celebrated and represented? And those are just yes and no questions. And then of course, I always like to put the box in the survey that says, whatever we didn't cover, tell us, free write, tell us what's going on here. So that we can get the actual raw responses. Now, they're not all, perfect, of course, but people are, again, very emotional and they're talking about their perceptions. And that's really what this is the perception that they're being included, that there is access and that their voice matters. That's what we need to get at. The other thing I want to suggest with climate surveys is that, and this happens a lot, I think, in academia, is that who is controlling the data? And how transparent is the data set, the raw data set when it comes out, rather than the spin that sort of gets in the report. So it's very important, two elements, that the raw data is shared with anyone who wants to see it, number one. And number two, that the IP addresses that they use or that use a third party that actually collects the data. That way people feel comfortable using their computers to answer those questions, and they don't feel like you could, because we've all watched too many police dramas, we know that the address is going to come back, right? So they want to make sure that they're in a safe space to answer honestly, that it's not going to come back and there will be some sort of retaliation. It's important that those elements are laid out, as Tammy said, so people feel safe answering honestly.
So thank you. You all have shared so much of yourself, being authentically who you are, and your passion for your work. I think what I've learned is that you must be really passionate about this work to do it and be committed to it through the highs, and at the end hug yourself, right, Diontrey? Because that's where you're going to get it. Just do this and say yes, because it's not going to hug you at night, but it's absolutely worth every effort to change the world collectively together. So right now I'd like you to each to give a piece of advice for those in the audience who are aspiring to do more DEI work in their current place, or to be eventually aspire to follow your career path. So just a piece of advice that you would give the audience members from your perspective of what they need to do or what they should do, or however you want to frame it.
Read. They need to read as much as you can. And when you're tired, read again. I actually posted in the chat the link that I was talking about for that diversity list. That's just the start. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I would say training and reading and professionally developing yourself. You don't have to go someplace to get the training. The training is out there. There's webinars, there's TED Talks. There's so much out there that's free to you and accessible. That's where that would be my advice.
Thank you.
I would say, don't feel like you have to make changes that are really major, big, visible, where you're trying to change thousands of people's minds and hearts. If you change one person's perspective in your life, you've done something worthy. I think we don't celebrate the small wins, and it's important that we start doing that. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's just the importance of celebrating all of our successes, no matter how big or small. So even if you plant the seed, right? Like even if you don't see that seed nourished, plant the seed in one person and you've done the DEI work.
Good point. Thank you. You're on mute, Diontrey.
Of course, still, year-end pandemic is still messing up. The advice I would leave people with is head heart work. Like DEI is very much heart, it's passion, it's also knowledge. It's also in there messy. I'm always gonna go back to the fact that it's messy, because the things that we want to do for people may not always be the logical thing, or may not always make the logical sense, especially when we're tackling things like disparities, inequities. You're like, logically, I should do this. But the heart is like, oh, I need to address this differently because it's about people experience. And so you have to kind of negotiate that constantly. And for me, it's always been a fun negotiation to grapple with, because it challenges me to think differently about how I approach situations and problems. And so lean into that head heart space.
Thank you. Great advice. So for the audience, I know we can't see your applaud, but I hope that you're applauding the amazing panel that we had today. Just a wonderful background from higher ed, biotech to medical, and again, all Rossier alum. So we're very proud of each and every one of you to be part of our school and to carry on the work that we have here to advancing educational equity. I just want to add to the training. Rossier is going to be launching a DEI certificate this fall for K-12. And then we're going to be launching one for higher ed in the spring for the following year. But if you want more information, it's still on the ground. We're working it out. But if you want to be on an information list, just email me at dprobles@usc.edu. And as we build it up, we'll send the information to you. So again, Nargis, Tammy, Diontrey, thank you so much. It was great to be with you, and I learned a lot. Thank you. I learned it doesn't hug you at night, and I have to remember that. So appreciate it, and wish you a great rest of the week and a great rest of the summer. And I hope we get to all travel a lot this year, a lot.
Soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It was a
Right
pleasure.
Right on.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, Nargis. Thank you, Tammy and Diontrey, for a wonderful session. For those of you that are still sticking around, thank you for attending. And know that I will be following up via email with a link to a recording of this session in case you want to go back and get those pearls of wisdom one more time, or even more importantly, if you know somebody that would really want to hear this information, share that link with them as well. So that will be coming via email along with the contact information for all of our speakers as well. So with that, I wish you all a great rest of your day, your weekend. Hope to see you at another Leadership Month session, and fight on.